for joining us this evening. My name is Cindy McGuire, and I'm the Programming and Marketing Coordinator at the Leavenworth Public Library. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Audrey Coleman for her presentation, Out of the Darkness, Records of the Vietnam War. This program is part of Humanities Kansas Speakers Bureau, and Humanities Kansas is a nonprofit spearheading a movement of ideas to empower the people of Kansas to strengthen their communities and our democracy. Audrey is the Assistant Director and Senior Archivist at the Dole Institute of Politics in Lawrence. She earned her Master's of Arts degree in Museum Studies from the University of Kansas. In her spare time, Audrey enjoys reading, cooking, dancing, and spending time with her husband and 2 young children. She joined the Humanities Kansas Speakers Bureau in 2016. Please welcome Audrey Coleman.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for that warm welcome. I'm so pleased to be here with you all this evening. And this has been something that Cindy and I have been trying to get on the books for a really long time. So it's extra grateful for the opportunity to visit with you all and share some of the things that we have with us in the archives. Thank you so much to Leavenworth Public Library and to Humanities Kansas. What a wonderful program. I'm so pleased to be a part of that. Tomorrow is Veterans Day. And so in honor of Veterans Day, I am pleased to be with you on that occasion as well. The Dole Institute, where I work as a senior archivist previously, is located on the University of Kansas campus and holds the records of Senators Bob and Elizabeth Dole. And the materials that I show with you for you tonight are going to be largely from Senator Bob Dole's collections, and be talking about treating the Vietnam War era as reflected through his career. So when he was elected to the House of Representatives in 1961 and then to the Senate in 1968, we will kind of see how he is able to relate to the events of Vietnam as a legislator and a politician. And so as a legislator, his job will reflect several things, and hear about what they are, what they're telling him, and what their thoughts are on the war in Vietnam at different points in time. Also, his duty is, I'm getting a message that my connection is unstable, so I apologize if we have some glitches here and there. Another area of his purview as a legislator, as a congressman, is working with policy, developing policy at the national and international level, hard-hitting politics nationally and internationally as well, and then finally advocacy. So we're going to be dealing with some material that may reflect some of your own knowledge about Vietnam. Maybe we're going to be learning some new things or rediscovering some stories that you may have heard or have forgotten, and probably also come up with some questions as well about what we might study and what other more stories that we can add to our understanding of the Vietnam War era and the Vietnam War in particular. So with that, I'll go ahead and get my slide presentation going. We're going to start our conversation this evening with 1969. Now, why start in 1965, pardon me. 1965 is the year that President Johnson sends combat troops to Vietnam. In March of that year, he sends Marines to Da Nang. Some scholars argue that our involvement, and rightly so, our involvement in Vietnam started a decade or more in the past. And then others will say, oh gosh, it started 100 years ago, before 1965, with the French Indochina War. But for the purposes of our discussion today, we're looking at 1965 because at that point, when troops are being sent and folks are being drafted, it's no longer a military operation. It's one that the American people at large really take notice of in a way that they hadn't before. And it really changes the landscape of folks' perceptions of Vietnam. And so because it affects their lives in a way that it hasn't before, they engage with their congressmen and senators and let them know how they feel. And so we're going to be looking at some constituent letters from the archives that show us some of the feedback that they're getting in response to the sending of troops in 1965. Let's see. Oops. First, I'll show a piece from the collection. It's a copy of President Johnson's speech toward peace with honor. This speech was given in July of 28th, 1965. And this was, as you can see here on the cover of it, this is an official copy, and it is signed by the president. And it was given and distributed to members of Congress after the press conference. It wasn't delivered to the Congress, so they were kind of known. They watched the press conference along with the rest of the country and heard about it later. In this speech, LBJ is answering this question, a very poignant one, and one that many thousands of Americans are asking: why must young Americans, born into a land exultant with hope and golden with promise, toil and suffer and sometimes die in such a remote and distant place? It's a perplexing question. And on this occasion, in this press conference, President Johnson is making the announcement that he is increasing draft calls from 17,000 men a month to 35,000. So this is a pretty urgent question that needs answered. Americans are anxious to have answered. Here is a page from that copy of that speech with Johnson's signature there. So here is the text of some of his speech. Essentially, his argument is that if we are to continue to build our American dream, our great society, the great society that he began to build beginning in August 1964, and pretty much had a mandate to continue the election year that year. With the congressional elections. He says we have to defend our great society against its enemies, the communists abroad, against those who hate and destroy. And in so doing so, this is our resistance, defending it from being swept away on the flood of conquest. So in essence, he's saying in order to build, in which builds, you can see that section heading there, in order to build, we have to go to war and protect our country on the far-flung shores of another land on the other side of the world. We have to have the courage to resist, or we will see it all that we have built, all that we hope to build, all of our dreams for freedom, all swept away on the flood of conquest.
Audrey,
yes.
we're not seeing what you're trying to share.
Oh, thank you for letting me know. Take a peek here. My screen share is paused. Resume share. Do you see now?
Yes.
Yes, great. Okay. So this was my stunning intro graphic that you all missed, but so maps to kind of situate where we are. China, communist China here, and North Vietnam here, and the map there. And I'll just scroll through. Here's our title and our piece of our documentation here that I just was referring to. And the central question, LBJ's answer. And we are back up to current. Thank you, Cindy, for letting me know. I could have gone on and on all night and without having the visuals. So, okay, so we look into the archives and we find out what is constituents' response, what are Americans' response to this. And looking in, this is, I'm going to be showing you some screenshots just periodically. These are called finding aids, and that's really all you need to know, but these are the research guides. They list materials in the archives. We're going to dive into some correspondence about Vietnam right now. So here we are, looking into box 111, say, and folder 4, and here we find some communication from constituents, this one from someone in Lyons, Kansas. In Lyons, Kansas, from September 9th, 1965, this person is essentially questioning the premise of the Vietnam War. And this is probably too small for you to see, but I've got some highlights here. So one perspective. I feel confident that if some foreign powers were to draw a boundary through Kansas at the 38th parallel and proceed to consider those north of the boundary as North Kansans and those south of the boundary as South Kansans, we would not feel too happy with matters. So this is some pretty serious foreign intervention in a land with which we have no stake, is what this person is saying. Mr. Dole, this preceding might sound rather far-fetched, but in fact, that is exactly what has happened in Vietnam. In 1954, the U.S. tentatively approved elections in Vietnam. It seems that only because our man could not win, we have done all in our power to prevent an election in that country. WIBW news from Topeka. Remember just a few broadcast news channels that we got our news from at that time. This is an editorial distributed by WIBW and probably recorded and aired on their newscast, also from September 1965. They're questioning the mere feasibility of victory. What is the plan? LBJ says that he has a plan and a vision for going forward in 1965 based on his Toward Peace with Honor speech. And the folks at WIBW are refuting that idea. There is every indication that the war in Vietnam is going to be long, bitter, and bloody. No end seems to be in sight. To those who are there, to the families of American servicemen who have been killed or wounded in action, the war is very real. More and more of the Vietnam War is becoming a reality to Americans. It must also be a reality to all branches of our government. Another piece from earlier that just a couple of weeks earlier in 1965, this constituent is concerned that we're heading straight for a nuclear war. Which was a very live concern at the time, and one, with the Cuban Missile Crisis that we encountered in the early 60s. This constituent is seeing that we're headed straight for a Third World War, a nuclear war. Only Congress has the right to declare war. Yet without a vote, we are in another escalation. We'll talk more about that, about the declaration of war that never came. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. The mandate for the last election was for peace. So really severe consequences folks are anticipating as a possibility for our invasion of Vietnam in 1965. Another letter from Quinter in November 1965 is again questioning the declaration of war and wondering if this can be characterized as a police action, and if our men can refuse to go, if they can refuse to respond to the draft. This woman is talking about a friend of hers claiming that she had heard that if this was a police action, as Korea was called at the time, that the boys had a right to refuse to go. She agreed that if this was a war, then it was everyone's duty to participate in a way to bring about an early termination of hostilities. So overall, this is a very general assessment of constituent correspondence, but there are a few themes here. They're talking about, should we be in Vietnam or not? Is even being there legal? And as this gentleman from Waukene writes in October 1965, he's concerned about who should go and fight this war. Concerned about students protesting, students in colleges across the country protesting and wondering why they are deferred from attending from the draft, and then while his neighbor, as he reads here, in fact has to go. Here's his argument. Just to see how unfair this thing is, one boy in our community had to stay home and help his parents after he graduated from high school for 3 years. He managed to get enough money to go to college 1 year, and then this last September he married and had to quit college. He was managing a filling station and making a very good citizen, one the country would be proud of. His number was called for the draft. Here he was, being a good citizen and living as one should in our grand old USA, and his number was called for the draft. The other side of the picture, students going to college to dodge a draft call and causing all trouble and chaos by demonstrating and trying to mob rule. Do you think this is right? So very poignant concerns, and we're not, the story is just starting to be written here in fall of 1965, and really the future is quite uncertain. Here's just a showing of material from our collections, reference material that would have come into Congressman Dole's office, educating him and giving editorial information about student protests that had started. I believe even in 1964, before combat operations start, there was some concern on college campuses, certainly in early 1965. And by the fall in 1965, there were teach-ins and student demonstrations. As you see here, a report of 25,000 demonstrating in Washington, D.C. So, LBJ articulating that vision in July of 1965, folks are really uncertain that this is something that we should be getting into. And our intuition is that it's not going to end well or soon. In response to the student unrest, Congressman Dole actually goes and visits Kansas in November of 1965, takes a few days from DC, hiatus from DC, and does a multi-campus tour around the state, visiting KU, as this clipping illustrates, him visiting with students on the campus of the University of Kansas. He also visited K-State, Kansas Wesleyan, I believe, and Washburn, and maybe Fort Hays State as well. But as you can see from the date on this clipping, this is completely coinciding with the letters that we're receiving, the student protests, ramping up. And so he's really wanting to come and talk to young people and hear what they have to say about this situation. Oh, and here's a press release. Test my memory. Let's see, Washburn, Kansas State, Fort Hays State. He says, meeting young people is always a challenge. I'm anxious to hear their comments on anything from Appalachia to Vietnam. So as a Republican, wanting to get students' feedback, not just on the Vietnam War, but also on the Great Society legislation and hear what they have to say. Interestingly enough, in the collection elsewhere, there's some materials from the Republican, from a National Committee for Republicans, and praising Congressman Dole for taking this very hands-on outreach approach. It was really not done at the time. There's quotes from then Congressman Donald Rumsfeld of Illinois. Some of you might recall that name. In more recent administrations, but he also was praising Congressman Dole for his outreach and getting boots on the ground, getting feedback from students. Here's a write-up from the University Daily Kansan reporting on Bob Dole's visit to KU. And in this clipping, there's some good quotes about what he finds when he visits Lawrence. He says that he supports President Johnson in Vietnam, that there is no choice, that we must go to Vietnam. But the problem, again, echoing Johnson's words, the problem is now to get to peace with honor. He says that demonstrators have the right to disagree, but that he himself voted for a measure against draft card burning. And he himself would characterize the demonstrators in 4 categories. First are those who are honestly criticizing our policy and believe that our methods are wrong. And then there are those who believe that communism is not a real threat and that the U.S. should not be responsible to Vietnam. Third are those who are pacifists and do not believe in war. And fourth are those who support communism and the Viet Cong. This last group is a small minority. So this is a really measured response, I think, in that he's not going out and trying to inflate the radical views of the students that he's visiting with, and not really buying into the idea that these folks are a threat or that they're too iconoclastic for our system, but that they all have a right to their own opinion. By May 1966, his office releases a press release and notes that even still, several months later, there's an unprecedented feeling of uneasiness and uncertainty about the war in Vietnam. He says it's just as apparent among leaders of Congress as it is throughout America. And he's calling on leaders in Congress and at the national. I'm getting a message that my connection is unstable, so I'm pausing. But he's saying this confidence will be restored. This is a great commentary on leadership. This confidence will be restored, America's confidence in leadership, in my opinion, in his own opinion, if those in policy-making positions give the American people the facts, if they will specifically define the objectives in Vietnam, and if they are great enough to admit mistakes. If there are signs of victory, solution, or further escalation, the American people have a right to know. Good advice for leaders at any time and place. So these are some examples of Congressman Dole getting out and hearing what Kansans have to say, receiving in his office materials that might inform his position on Vietnam and give him hopefully some actionable information on how he can best represent Kansas in Vietnam, or excuse me, in Congress regarding Vietnam. So moving on to some examples of policy and politics in the collections and the records that we have at the Institute. By 1966, Bob Dole is a congressman, but by that time he's been reelected 3 times, and he's going on a 4th later that year, going for a 4th term in the House. So he is seen, by his reelection, we can assume that he's being, accurately to constituent satisfaction, accurate, representing their points of view. He's listening and learning from his constituents, and he's trying to find positions of influence. Where can he make change, and what can he do as a congressman from Kansas to get involved and maybe ameliorate the situation as best as he can. I'm looking at a different place in our collection now. We're going to look at some materials from box 180, and it's called Food for Peace information. So I'll flip on that. So Congressman Dole, being from Kansas and being from Western Kansas, a big portion of his concern and the concern of his constituent is agriculture, farming, and agricultural policy. He's going to look for ways to promote the interests of Kansas farmers to the greatest extent possible. And in 1966 and in the years before that, he finds a way to do that. And it's connected to international policy related to Vietnam. So this is a image of a document promoting this Food for Peace program. And Food for Peace actually was put in place by the Kennedy administration. It was an idea developed during the Eisenhower administration. And it was a way in which that we could get American farmers to share surpluses around the world. And here the points, the benefits of us engaging in this program as a nation are well represented here. We're moving our agricultural surplus. We're feeding hungry people around the world. We're spurring foreign economic development, developing U.S. markets, promoting security, and other reasons to do that, to share, the grain surpluses that we have as a country. This is an image from a publication from 1968 showing other countries, foreign countries who may be under, duress and having shortages of food stores. So in 1966, Congressman Bob Dole travels with a bipartisan group of legislators. One is Congressman Pogue from Texas, a Democrat, so they're working on a bipartisan basis. Representing the interests of our country, finding out what to do with these grain stores as a part of the Food for Peace programming. They're visiting India, where they're having food shortages very dramatically. It's affecting the goodwill, the well-being of the people of India, as well as the stability of the country. And so that's something good that we've done as a nation to provide them with Kansas wheat and other commodities to help abate the problems that they're having there. But it's important that when we think about, we're being the good guy and helping Kansas farmers, there's some very live geopolitical strategy going on here. To remind us, we can look at this map and see the relationship of Vietnam here in the green, communist China, communist Russia, and we're fighting against the communists in Vietnam and trying to prevent their incursion into Vietnam and spreading into Southeast Asia. India at this time is our ally, but they're openly critical of our policy of war in Vietnam. And so not only are we helping ourselves and helping the people of India by sharing the food stores that we have, very strategically, we are making friends and allies, international global security by reaching out to the people of India. And so that was one way, a very interesting way, I think, that Bob Dole was able to get involved, even as a congressman, one of 400 some members of the House of Representatives, and from a smaller population state in the center of the country, can really make a big difference, big contributions on the global stage, particularly during the Vietnam era in this way. Another interesting story from the archives is more pure politics and less policy. So this is a cartoon from we've got it covered up here. I believe it's a Washington newspaper. Oops. I can't get that. My screen share window is obscuring the citation up there. I apologize, and I can't move it without it dancing around and distracting me. So it's from a Washington newspaper, as we can see. So what's going on here in this cartoon? Well, we can see that it's from June 24th, 1970. We have kind of a circus going on, animal trainers. We've got some dogs here, a dancing poodle that is marked Tonkin Gulf Repeal, and who we would recognize as President Nixon, shaking his cane and encouraging the dog to dance. Behind the curtain, we have Senator William Fulbright, a Democrat from Arkansas, looking dejected, appalled with his own dog, and he says, "Hey, that was supposed to be my act." So what's going on here? Well, we mentioned, in the conversation about the constituent mail, a couple of folks rightly, picked up on the fact and were attuned to the fact that the incursion or combat movements in Vietnam were not part of a declared war, and that was definitely true. War was never declared in Vietnam. But how did the president then be authorized to begin these movements? It began with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964. In the summer of 1964, President Johnson asserted that U.S. destroyers Maddox and the Sea Tuner Joyoff were attacked unprovoked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. And he takes this information back to Congress and says, look, they're provoking us. We have no choice but to retaliate. I say that President Johnson asserted this, that we were fired upon, because many years later, even by folks who were present, said that actually this didn't happen this way. But this was the information that President Johnson took to Congress. Congress, perceiving the threat, voted almost unanimously in the House of Representatives, and 82-2 in the Senate. Bob Dole voted for the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in August 1964. And its stated purpose was to approve and support the determination of the president as commander-in-chief in taking all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the U.S. and to prevent further aggression. It also declared that the maintenance of international peace and security in Southeast Asia was vital to American interests and to world peace. So the stakes are raised in Vietnam. We have no choice but to go there. It's for our own interests. All these arguments are being made. Congress votes for President Johnson to have the initiative to do a blank check, do what he sees necessary to preserve the peace, to defend America in Vietnam. But as we're looking here in 1970, the war is not over. We have a new president. President Richard Nixon was elected in 1968 and became the president in 1969. And even as he was hoping to draw down troops, part of his platform was to end the war in Vietnam, which is a good platform to run on when you're running against during a war. President Johnson himself did not seek another term. Nixon won, and at that time had still not ended the war, and folks were being really frustrated. Although troops had decreased by a couple 100,000 by 1970 from a high of 500,000 in 1968, it still wasn't over. We were still there. And as we found out in spring of 1970, Richard Nixon was wanting to send combat troops into neighboring Cambodia. So rather than drawing down, reducing the footprint, reducing operations in Vietnam, he's now proposing to expand them into another country, to follow the North Vietnamese into neighboring Cambodia. And little did we know at the time, he had already been bombing Cambodia for over a year at that point. Well, Nixon asks Congress or says he's going to send combat troops into Cambodia, expand operations into Cambodia, and Congress at this time doesn't like that, and they've had enough. They proposed a couple of solutions to try to limit his operations and his management of the war, the expansion of the war. One strategy they can use is to repeal the Gulf of Tonkin Amendment, which would revoke the power granted to President Johnson. And the other tactic they can take is to pass an amendment called the Cooper-Church Amendment, named for the two gentlemen who proposed it, and in so doing, eliminate the funding for the expansion of combat into Cambodia. So if they can't tell the president what to do, they can at least have the power of the purse, keep the money from flowing in his direction for that particular operation. Before, the Democrats, who had the majority in both the House and the Senate, I mentioned, Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968. He did not have the Republicans were minorities in both houses at the time, so he didn't have the power really to do very much. And the Democrats, seeing the results of the Vietnam War, it's gone on for 5 years as a result of this Gulf of Tonkin resolution that was passed in 1964. They're kind of eager to make good and kind of repudiate the president's actions. And also make themselves, solve their own problem, fix their own mistake, and take care of business that way. So there's this Gulf of Tonkin repeal resolution is in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, headed by Senator Fulbright, who's pictured here in the cartoon. But before he can get that amendment or the repeal to the floor, young junior senator from Kansas, Bob Dole, who had only been in the Senate since January 1969, actually kind of subverted etiquette at that time. They knew this was being considered in the committee, and Bob Dole goes to the floor and puts the amendment forward on his own, representing it as himself. So outside of the Foreign Relations Committee, it gets approved and sent up to the president, who also approves it and said, I never used the powers granted to me in the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the original one. And so I'm happy to repeal this amendment and fix this problem that the Democrats started. For his part, the Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield was very big about it and spoke in a bipartisan sort of way. He didn't need to have Democrats score points on that front. He was ready to, he was content to have the Cooper-Church Amendment passed in the Senate, which it also did. So he had this kind of twofer, which was to get the Gulf of Tonkin Amendment off the table, by whatever means, even if the Democrats weren't the ones to do it. And then also, the Senate Democrats were successful in holding back the money for the Cambodian incursion, with the Cooper Church Amendment. So, lots of political wrangling going on, some of it posturing on the part of both parties, but you can see they're both into the Vietnam War. Several years in, are heavily invested and really grappling for ways out and trying to themselves each take the reins of power. I got ahead of myself a little bit, but as you can see, the cartoon that with the backstory, the cartoon makes more sense. Nixon and Dole, who is not pictured, kind of upstaged the circus, or it's got interesting here. Here are documents, showing the formal proceedings on the Senate floor on June 22nd, 1970, the day that Bob Dole put the resolution, the repeal of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, to the Senate and introduced it on the floor. And a newspaper article reporting their success, saying that the Nixon administration has won this political round, this political debate. And there we are. Reported later in a newspaper article in June 1970, Dole said it was the policy device, and by that he's referring to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. It was the policy device of a previous administration which sought to expand the American presence in Vietnam. The Nixon administration have never relied upon nor involved the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in the formulation and execution of its policy. Moving away, I mentioned earlier at the start of the talk that we're talking about various modes of operation and functions that a legislator enacts when they're a member of Congress or senator. We've talked about constituent relations. We've talked about policy formation and politics, and now we're going to talk about a couple of examples of advocacy here. So dipping into a different part of the collection, we're kind of going into some subject files, and we see one specifically dedicated to the 69th Brigade, which is a National Guard unit in Kansas, the 69th Brigade in Vietnam. We're kind of going back in time a little bit from the previous example, but if we could kind of situate ourselves in 1968 and 1969, Bob Dole is elected to the Senate in 1968. He begins his first term in the Senate in January of 1969. And this dealing with these materials and the situation that we're about to discuss is going to be one of the very first things that he does after his swearing into the Senate. So who was the 69th Brigade? We have some details from the brigade's own history from their website. It's getting some context here. On 11th April 1968, a presidential order mustered 12,867 Army Guardsmen from 17 states into federal service. Among those called were the men of the 69th Infantry Brigade. As a result of the April 4th assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., rioting occurred in most major U.S. cities, including Kansas City, Missouri. Some of the 69th Infantry Brigade in Kansas City, Kansas, effectively sealed off the western sector of Kansas that lay adjacent to Kansas City, Missouri, to prevent violence in Wyandotte and Johnson counties. On May 23rd, 1968, the 69th Brigade arrived at Fort Carson in Colorado to train and prepare for deployment to Vietnam. And between 1968 and May 1969, 2,301 officers and enlisted men were sent to Vietnam from Fort Carson. Finally, about 60% of the enlisted men and 95% of the officers of the 69th were levied. All but a few went to Vietnam. And so the material that we are seeing reflected in the collection is dealing with the deployment of the 69th Brigade and to Vietnam. A lot of materials and the letters that we see are expressing concern that their loved one will be serving. These are reservists. These are National Guard, members of the National Guard. They tend to be older, more well-established. They have families, as the brigade website mentions, they're members of the soft professions. And so they tend to have a lot more ties home, and the emotions and the concerns expressed by their families are quite extensive, and with good reason. There's a whole folder, a whole unit of material devoted to these people's, the experience of the loved ones of the members of the 69th Brigade, and what their experience is being. So why are they called up in 1968? Why is this happening? Well, as we mentioned, in 1968, we reached a peak level of troops, 500,000 sometime during that year. But it's at the beginning of the year, and in great response to the North Vietnamese Tet Offensive at the end of January 1968, in which the North Vietnamese coordinated attacks on sites across South Vietnam. I believe it's nearly 100 sites or more, cities and military installations. They were surprise attacks and took the U.S. and the South Vietnamese completely off guard in the planning. And it was also executed on a holiday for the Tet holiday, which was kind of like staging an attack on Christmas. So they were completely blindsided by this very well-coordinated, extensive attack. And so President Johnson at the time really ramps up his response in terms of troop levels. Before that, though, interestingly, about a week before, the USS Pueblo off the coast of Korea, it's an American spy ship and disguised as an environmental research boat, was attacked and captured by the North Koreans. And so there's some threat there from communist forces in North Korea. Exactly 11 months after its capture, the USS Pueblo, and the 82 surviving crew members were released back to the U.S., but the ship remained in North Korea. So we've got these two, events that is threatening and complicating operations on the peninsula and in the area. And we're calling in the 69th Brigade to help address those issues. Interestingly enough, it's not the Tet Offensive that is cited in the letters from the families as the reason for the deployment of the 69th Brigade. It's the capture of the Pueblo by the North Koreans. And so there's a lot of confusion from family members when the servicemen who are returned at the end of December and December 1968. There's a lot of letters saying, okay, is my loved one coming home? Is my man coming home? We have the understanding that they were sent there in response to this Pueblo incident. And so the materials that I'm going to be showing you subsequently here reflect that concern. And they're looking for help for Senator Dole to get some clarification about what's happening, because actually their men aren't coming home. They're being asked to stay for longer and serve out their term of duty. So it's really interesting how comparing the archival materials and the personal materials against official histories. And it makes me wonder what kinds of conversations were had among these servicemen and their families in response to the Pueblo and the Tet Offensive in 1968. So I'll read some of the passages from these letters. This is a letter written to Senator Dole from the Department of the Army, and it was received in the Dole's offices in February 1969. So again, looking at the timing, Senator Dole would have had to write this immediately upon taking office in the Senate in late January. So this piece says, "Dear Senator Dole, this is in reply to your inquiry concerning a letter you have received," and the name is blocked out. She questioned the justification for retaining mobilized National Guardsmen and reservists on active duty in view of discussions concerning imminent withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam and the release of the Pueblo crew. Please be assured that there are no plans for the immediate withdrawal of Army troop units from South Vietnam. All of the Army units currently in Vietnam are needed to meet military requirements in that country, and there are no indications that they will be returning to the U.S. in the near future. While the return of the Pueblo crew has lessened tensions somewhat and might appear to some to make possible the release of units mobilized last spring, the many other international considerations which necessitated the mobilization remain essentially the same, and units and men from the reserve components are still needed. Another follow-up addressing really specific questions, from Senator Dole. He's asking questions, again, what were the reasons for the mobilization? Do they still exist? Is the release earlier than December 1969 even possible? This is a subsequent communication. This is in reply to your inquiry concerning letters you have received from members of the 69th Infantry Brigade. What were the reasons for the mobilization? Do they still exist? He's pressing. The mobilization in May 1968 resulted from an intensification of the communist aggression in South Vietnam and greatly increased tension throughout the rest of Asia. Communist Tet Offensive, the increased activity of North Korean agents south of the Korean demilitarized zone, and the seizure of the USS Pueblo all contributed to the decision to strengthen our military forces. Although our representatives were successful in negotiating the release of the Pueblo crew, the basic reason for the mobilization, communist aggressiveness in South Vietnam and Korea, is still very evident. It may be of interest that even though the Army has been required to employ 121% as many troops in South Vietnam as was the case in Korea in the years between 1950 and 1953, only 8% as many citizen soldiers have been mobilized. Dole worked with, in this next series of letters, these are letters written by the governor of Kansas, Robert Docking, in May 1969. Dole and Governor Docking are working together again to try to get the brigade home, and earlier than the scheduled December 1969, again, based upon this asserted justification that they were out there to address communist incursion and ameliorate the Pueblo situation. So Governor Docking is sending this letter to President Nixon. He's sending it to Mel Laird, who's the Secretary of Defense, and also to Stanley R. Reeser, the Secretary of the Army at the Pentagon, along with Mel Laird. And so at this point, Governor Docking is requesting that when the Guardsmen return to the U.S., that they be processed through Fort Carson so that they can be nearer to their families, recognizing that an early release is unlikely, if not impossible. The story of the 69th Brigade ends like this. The brigade received the best evaluation ratings of any major unit at Fort Carson from 1968 to May 1969. In the summer of 1969, it was announced that members of the 68th could be released early from active duty to return to school or certain seasonal type jobs, but it wasn't until December 13th, 1969 that they returned to Kansas. Of the 324 officers and 2,073 enlisted men of the brigade who served in Vietnam, 40 paid the supreme sacrifice, with hundreds being wounded in Vietnamese combat. 11 men of the brigade were awarded the Silver Star Medal. And then finally, our last kind of anecdote or story that we'll be diving into concerns prisoners of war during Vietnam. This actually is a press release from July 22nd, 1968, that was released by then Congressman Dole before he's elected to the Senate. And it's responding to the capture of the USS Pueblo. And so early on, he has an interest in prisoners of war. He's asking for the release of the Pueblo crew to be accomplished immediately. It's July. At the time of the writing of this document, they'd been captured since January. And he's citing that he has a hometown native of Russell, Kansas, is among the prisoners as well. So he's advocating for prisoners of war as regards to the USS Pueblo. More broadly, however, he's working with, by 1970, he's working with a group of women, a group of wives whose husbands were prisoners of war or missing in Vietnam. They founded an organization called the National League of Families of American Prisoners of Missing in Southeast Asia. And some of their records and correspondence and activities are documented within the Dole archives. So in 1964, even before combat operations in Vietnam started, men were starting to be captured, particularly aviators flying into North Vietnam, some in South Vietnam as well. So the earliest prisoners of war who were captured in 64 and 65 and then not released until 1973 were imprisoned for almost 9 years. Which in itself is a horrible trial. And the men who were captured and survived are heroes. The men who were captured and did not make it home were certainly heroes, as were the missing in action. So the first prisoners of war are going missing in 64 and 65. Mostly they're Navy and Air Force pilots flying over North Vietnam and getting shot down there. It wasn't until 1968 that women, wives, felt comfortable coming forward and letting the public know that their husbands were missing. There were several hundred, if not 1,000 of these men, and their families scattered across the country. There were women located centralized in the San Diego, Coronado area. There are women in Colorado Springs, Colorado, with the Air Force Academy there, also in Virginia Beach, Navy installation there, and women whose husbands were lost without communication and without communication from their husbands and without updates from their government, waited for years and years before they were able to get any attention at all. And so if you're thinking about, your loved one going missing in 64, 65 or subsequent years, and you're waiting until 1968, 1969 to finally go public to let people know that this is happening. They were strongly advised by the Johnson administration and the military leaders at the time. They should not be talking about the fact that their husbands were missing and unaccounted for. Possibly prisoners of war was considered a security risk. And it was also something that along with many other aspects of the Vietnam War, that they just didn't want the general public to find out about. But it was in 1968 and 69 that the women in San Diego finally rallied together and decided that this issue needed some attention. It had been years. Their children were growing up. They were managing households all on their own. In some cases, they weren't receiving compensation, the due compensation for their husbands. Their husbands weren't declared dead, but they were their benefits were running out. They were in this kind of legal limbo where they weren't able to claim benefits on account of their death, but they were also losing paychecks because their husband was not working. It was a trial of an experience under any circumstances. But it's in 1968 and 69 that the women in San Diego, led by Sybil Stockdale, who was the wife of Admiral James Stockdale, some of you might remember his name, one of the most famous prisoners of war. She got her women together in Coronado and said, this has got to stop. We're going to tell people about this, and we're going to demand answers from our government. They actually go to D.C. in 1969 to meet with President Nixon, and in 1970 hold a couple of rallies in D.C. to build awareness for the prisoner of war cause. The gentleman pictured here in this postcard, as you can see, is named Major Bruce Johnson. He's from Harbor Beach, Michigan, but his wife and family during Vietnam actually lived in Schilling Manor and Salina, Kansas, among other Vietnam War wives and their families. And so they claimed Kansas as their home for many years. But as you can see, Bruce Johnson was one of these who went missing early on in 1965. His wife, Kathleen Johnson, was one of the founding members of the National League of Families alongside Sybil Stockdale. And here you can see a poster that was created for the purpose of promoting a rally that they call the famous International Appeal for International Justice on May 1st, 1970. It took place at the DAR Constitution Hall. And Senator Dole was one of the first people to hear the women, Kathleen Johnson, and he were able to get in touch, and he was very supportive of their cause. You can see across the top, if you know you're a history wonk and you know your senators, you can look at this. Won't you join Senators Dole, Dominic, Goldwater, Mansfield, Murphy, Muskie, Stennis, and then the list of congressmen, that it's a bipartisan group of congressmen building awareness for the cause of the prisoners of war. It's after this time, around May 1st, that the National League of Families is incorporated as a nonprofit organization, and they open up an office in Washington, D.C. For the purpose of advocating for their husbands. In the center photo, you can see Bob Dole at the table, Sybil Stockdale, Admiral Stockdale's wife, and really the leader of the League of Families movement and organization. She's the founding director. And then in the center is Ross Perot, a Texas businessman who, private citizen who was very supportive of the POW wives and their families. In this clipping, this is Kathleen Johnson. Her husband was pictured earlier, was Bruce Johnson. These are her children. Oh, I forgot to make a point here. In this clipping, this is a clipping of women attending a joint session of Congress to hear more about what Congress intends to do or what can be done about the well-being of their husbands and their eventual return, trying to get any information about their status and how they can get communication to them, and places like the Hanoi Hilton and other North Vietnamese prisons. This caption of the photo quotes Milton, and it says, "They also serve who only stand and wait." And that is definitely true. The military spouses sacrificing and serving alongside their spouse who may be deployed or fighting elsewhere in the country. But these women certainly were not, this is only half accurate, as these ladies were not only standing and waiting, as we can see very well from the historical record. And this is the image of Kathleen Johnson with her children. There was Ross Perot actually sponsored a flight to Paris. It was called the Christmas Express. And these women with their families flew 24 hours to try to meet with the North Vietnamese and go to the embassy and try to get some answers for their husbands. They weren't ultimately successful, but they did things like that. And other occasions, some of them engaged in advocacy, flying to Stockholm and trying to engage in peace talks there in Sweden. Kathleen herself actually went back to Paris on her own, again, wrote letters to the Vietnamese embassy trying to make connections with them and Madame Bin and find out what might have become of her husband. Stateside, they went on a lot of speaking tours and really rallied and were kind of what you might think of as a grassroots movement, but they were a group of military wives, and they did it their own way, really moving from being private support for their husbands and families into this leadership role, public role that none of them had ever envisioned. And this piece of documentation here on the screen is a summary of the Articles of Incorporation of the National League of Families, and below you can see some of the founding board members, including Sybil Stockdale and Mrs. Bruce Johnson, who of course is Kathleen here, Kansan. This is a photograph. In 1969, Nixon was invited the women to the White House. This is the first press conference that he had with them. Of course, he was supportive of their cause at any rate, but also the war is going poorly, as we noted. He was advocating for expansion of the war in Cambodia in 1970. There had been unrest and violent protests at Kent State and Jackson State in 1970. And so he's definitely not naive about opportunities to find ways to make himself look better in front of the American public, and allying with the wives and their cause is one way he can do that. Sybil Stockdale is as we look at the photo, is to his left. The suit that she's wearing is actually bright hot pink. We've displayed it at the Institute and in an exhibit that has traveled around the country. And so it's fun to think about how these women presented themselves. The woman on his right is a woman named Audrey. She lived in Baltimore, and I had the great privilege of meeting her and interviewing her once. And I had to ask her, what are you thinking? She's giving him a great look. And she said, I was thinking, what are you going to do about it? We have heard so much from all these politicians and leaders, and nobody has helped us. And so that's a very highly skeptical face she has there. Ultimately, we know with the end of the war, the withdrawal of U.S. troops in 1973 in January, finally being successful, nearly 600 of the prisoners of war returned in Operation Homecoming in 1973. President Nixon had a big state house, the largest state dinner at the White House here on February 12th, 1973, to welcome them all home. And you can see some of the celebrities who appeared there. At the same time, if you're looking back on your history and realizing that the Watergate, is kind of starting to bubble up, he has not been accused of being implicated. They haven't figured out that he has been connected with the Watergate break-ins, but there are starting to raise questions, and so that's interesting. There was see footage of this particular event. He looks quite stressed when he might seem very joyful, and is really looking for something to celebrate, getting troops out of Vietnam, and also celebrating the prisoners of war returning. Of course, not everybody, not everyone had their loved one return, their servicemen return. Kathleen Johnson was one of those, and her husband, Bruce, was listed as MIA until the late 70s. And it has really been interesting to get to know her and her family and hear more about their experiences. And we think about the years of loss and longing and not knowing, and how that makes an impression on children, but also on her as well. These women are just ironclad, strong. And so it's a great story of advocacy. Senator Dole would count himself as lucky to have been associated with these women and be inspired by the leadership and the courage of the wives of the National League of Families. Just in closing, in 1973, we just talked about Operation Homecoming in 1973. Senator Dole puts out a press release asking the question, the battle flags are home. How did it all begin? A people such as ours cannot simply reply with weary indifference. If one only knew how it began. We must know we have paid bitterly for whatever wisdom there may be in this longest war. And if from that wisdom we may get peace and reconciliation, or if by that wisdom we may prevent the loss of other future lives, then we should we not seek that wisdom? I think we must. So these are some of the stories, and a handful of the kinds of perspectives, the kinds of activities, the kinds of truths that we can uncover in the archives, and that invite us to learn more about these different areas, and maybe some of these topics add to the historical record. In the archives, we're always encouraging scholars to come and use the materials. They're actually a relatively new historical archival collection, meaning that they haven't been open for very long. And so there's lots of untapped material that can only add to our more complete understanding of history in general, and in particular on the topic of the Vietnam War. The more we know about our history, the less in the dark we are, and the better equipped we are to make new decisions and work towards more enlightened leadership of our country. And does anybody have any questions this evening? It's been a real pleasure to visit with you all. I'm not sure, I haven't kept an eye on the time. If there aren't any questions, here's my quote from one of my favorite archivists: "We are what we keep, and we keep what we are." Again, that lesson that we need to keep track of our history so that we can learn from it and know ourselves and make informed decisions in the future.
Well, thank you, Audrey. That was a very fascinating presentation. And I'm glad that we could finally get this program going. We were hoping to do this last year. It's been a long time coming, but it was very interesting. It was worth the wait. And with that, I think we will say goodnight and thank you again for your presentation.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you all. Have a great evening.